My name is Paula Gatillo. I'm a hydrologist for the National Park Service Water Resources Division. And I want to thank you very much for your time and attention to this issue. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today. And I've been working with Keauhou National Historical Park on this issue since about 2007. I attended the National Park Service Working Group meetings and most of the Kona Water Roundtable meetings, the Water Professionals Group meetings, and I've presented to the Roundtable, to the Commission, to the County Council on this issue. And I'm going to give a scientific overview of the information in the petition, and Sally Beavers is also going to talk, is going to help me out with this talk. And so, as you know, there are eight criteria in the State Water Code for your consideration in designating groundwater management areas. The petition addresses 6 of these 8 criteria. I'm not going to go over each criteria, but rather I would like to give you some background information that will help you in reviewing the petition. Okay. And these criteria are discussed on pages 23 through 47 of the petition. Okay. So what I'd like to talk about are potential threats to water resources in the park, our understanding of the hydrogeology of the aquifer system in the area of the park. And Sally's going to talk about aquatic habitat and the role that freshwater plays in providing habitat for native species in the park. And we will both try to also explain some of the uncertainty surrounding these topics. Okay. So as you heard today, water resources in the park include the coral reef, tide pools, ancholine pools, wetlands, and fish ponds. These resources are relatively healthy. We do not have evidence that existing pumping has adversely affected these resources. And what we are asking is analogous to an in-stream flow for groundwater to keep these resources healthy. So it's been suggested to us that we should wait for impacts to be observed and then ask for restrictions on pumping. This would be like trying to put water back in the stream after you diverted too much. I think you've been in that situation, and it's a situation we would like to avoid. Okay. So if the resources are healthy, why are we concerned? This is a map of the ahupua'a, the park. That's the pink area. The yellow hatched area is proposed development around the park. The map also shows pumping wells and observation wells. And the green circle around the wells in the bottom, that's the Keauhou shaft and well field. And these were the only wells that were pumping when the park was established in 1978. And in the early 90s, chlorides in the Keauhou shaft started to exceed the recommended limit for chloride in drinking water. So this chart shows pumping and chlorides in the Keauhou shaft. And so this led to exploration for alternative water sources and the development of the high-level aquifer. So most of the wells drilled since then have been in the high-level aquifer, and now there are pumping wells within the ahupua'a of the park in both the high-level and the basal aquifer. And the proposed development is targeting both the high-level and the basal aquifer for future water supply. We're particularly concerned about proposals to desalinate brackish groundwater in the area of the park. We visited one desalination plant today, but since we've been involved and participating in the Kona Water Roundtable and the working group, 3 other desalination plants have been proposed around the park. Most recently, the 2013 Keauhou EIS has proposed it includes a proposal. One of their proposals is to withdraw 11 million gallons per day of brackish groundwater, that's 30 parts per thousand, right across the street from the park to provide drinking water for a new development. Okay. And the 2010 Water Use and Development Plan also includes a recommendation to to desalinate groundwater, upgrading of the park to meet future water demand. Okay, so there are proposals, there are pumping wells in the high level and basal aquifer in the area of the park, and there are proposals to construct additional wells in those areas. And so why do we think that what we're concerned about is the cumulative effects of existing and proposed withdrawals. And so I'd like to talk about why we're concerned about those effects. And I'm going to talk about recharge and discharge areas, conceptual and mathematical models of the aquifer system, and some of the monitoring data. Okay. This is a thermal infrared image. It's from Craig Glenn's group at the University of Hawaii, and Craig is here today. And on this image, blue is colder water, and red is warmer water. And what it shows is colder water discharging to the harbor and Aimakapa fish pond in the area of the park. This study also identified 31 major groundwater plumes where colder water is discharging to the nearshore waters along the Kona coast. Okay. This is the USGS has documented that colder water is also fresher than seawater. So this is an image from Eric Grossman's report. It shows here blue is fresher water and red is seawater. And so it shows fresher water discharging to the harbor. And on this image, it includes Koloko and Aimakapa fish ponds. Okay, so where does this colder, fresher water come from? Okay. This is, in 2011, the USGS published recharge estimates for the Big Island. And this is a map of recharge on the Big Island. So what I did here was I overlaid the aquifer boundaries on this image from John Engott's report. And what you can see is that recharge is not evenly distributed throughout the Keauhou aquifer system, but in general it increases with elevation. So we have very good information, recent information about where and how much groundwater enters the system. We have a pretty good idea of where it discharges from the system. So what happens between areas of recharge and discharge? Okay. So to answer that question, hydrologists develop conceptual models. So Delwyn showed this image, and it's the traditional conceptual model of the aquifer system in the area of the park. It includes the high-level aquifer and the basal aquifer, and according to this model, all the recharge to the high-level aquifer discharges or flows through the basal aquifer and discharges along the coast. But recent drilling and geophysical work has indicated that the aquifer system is more complex than this. Go to the next one. Wells have encountered perched aquifers in the Keauhou aquifer system. And as Delwyn explained, the Kamakana well encountered fresh water below seawater in the basal aquifer. And these models are discussed in the petition, and the implications of this new data are discussed in the petition. And one of the major implications of this new conceptual model is that the basal aquifer may be receiving less recharge than previously believed. This would make it more vulnerable to pumping and saltwater intrusion. Okay, so how can we quantify the effects of withdrawals on the aquifer system? So, oh, I'm sorry, let me back up. Delwyn presented isotope data, and this data is from Craig Glenn and Joe Fackrell. They're at the University of Hawaii. They've also looked at nutrients and isotopes in the water samples around the park, and they've concluded that you can click. Yeah, they concluded that they've also concluded that the high-level aquifer is hydrologically connected to the basal aquifer in the area of the park. So there's uncertainty about how much water flows from the high-level aquifer to the basal aquifer. There's also uncertainty about where water in that deeper freshwater confined aquifer where that discharges. But geochemical or geochemistry data can help us reduce the scientific uncertainty around those questions. Okay. So what happens when we withdraw water from the aquifer system? In general, when water levels stabilize in a pumping well, the well starts to capture water that would otherwise discharge along the coast. And at the scale of an individual well, these effects are a function of the depth of the well, the pumping rate, the location of the well relative to boundaries, and also the actual properties of the aquifer. It's a function of those things and not recharge. Okay? So if wells are capturing water that would otherwise discharge to the coast, this causes salt water to move inland and up in elevation. This would cause the salinity of water in the basal aquifer to increase. It also causes water levels to decline. And so these are the effects that we're asking you to consider when you permit new wells in the aquifer system. Okay? So how can we quantify the effects of withdrawals? So hydrologists use mathematical models to look at the direct and cumulative effects of withdrawals on the aquifer system. And just as the conceptual models of the aquifer system have evolved over time, so have mathematical models of the aquifer system. In the early 90s, RAM was developed as a tool for calculating sustainable yield. It's a robust analytical model, or RAM. And this is the equation. You can see that it's a simple equation. It can be solved by hand. And sustainable yield is a function of recharge and a change in water level. And to set the sustainable yield for the Keauhou aquifer system, the Commission estimated recharge to be about 87 million gallons per day. And they decided to limit water level declines to 25% of the pre-development water levels. And that was to protect the water quality at coastal pumping wells. Okay. And the RAM model makes several simplifying assumptions. It assumes that the entire aquifer system is a basal aquifer, that recharge and wells are evenly distributed, and that there's a sharp interface between fresh water and salt water. Okay. So in the mid-90s, the office that I work in recognized some of the limitations of RAM and asked the USGS to develop a model to better understand how planned use might affect groundwater withdrawals how planned use might affect water resources in the park. Oh, I got ahead of myself. Just to summarize. No. Let me go over this slide. It's an important point, and I'm sorry I was about to skip it. That the RAM model, or the method used to calculate sustainable yield, it predicts that water levels will be reduced by about 25% if pumping reaches a sustainable yield. It also predicts that discharge would be reduced by about half along the coast. Okay? And this calculation does not explicitly consider the water needed for non-consumptive public trust uses. And we're not certain that leaving about half the water in the ground is a sufficient margin of safety to protect resources in the park. Okay. And this is discussed in the petition. Okay. And so I jumped ahead, and we asked the USGS to develop to further investigate how planned use might affect water resources in the park. And they developed, Delwin and his co-authors developed a numerical model. And numerical models, what they do is take the area of concern and divide it into a grid, and then they solve those same equations that RAM was derived from at every cell in the grid. And this allows you to incorporate some more complexity. So a general rule of thumb for modeling is you start simple, you add complexity as you get that information to justify it. So this model includes the high-level aquifer. And go ahead. What this model predicted is that if all permitted wells at that time were pumped to their full capacity, water levels in the park would decline by about half a foot, and discharge would decline by about half before the sustainable yield was reached. And that's due to the locations of the wells, the actual locations of permitted wells at that time. Okay, so both of the models, RAM and the numerical model, anticipate that development will reduce water levels and discharge in the area of the park. They cannot tell us how salinity might change, and that's one of the important things for looking at potential impacts to aquatic habitat. So again, our office asked the USGS to look into how planned use might affect salinity in the park. And that's the model, go ahead, so that's the model that Delwyn is working on now. He's incorporating the salinity and temperature profiles from the Kamakana well. He's also incorporating the new recharge estimates and the geochemical data. And he talked about the time frame for those results. Okay. And all of this is discussed in the petition. Okay. So when we present this information, people often ask us, well, does the monitoring data in the park show impacts from existing withdrawals? And so I'm going to talk about the monitoring data. In general, there are two types of monitoring data, continuous and periodic data. Okay. There are 3 shallow monitor wells in the park, and water levels are recorded every 15 minutes in all 3 wells, and salinity and temperature is recorded every 15 minutes in 2 of the wells. Okay. And this morning you saw the Shores at Keauhou, and they have 8 observation wells, and they report water levels and chlorides monthly in those wells, and that's an example of periodic data. Okay. We also have periodic data, sparse periodic data from Aimakapa Fish Pond and 2 ancholine pools in the park. This data starts around in the 70s, and just a visual inspection of these data indicates that salinity may be increasing over time. But these data were collected by different people using different equipment, and so we were being very cautious in using it to confirm or identify long-term trends. Okay? And this is in the petition. And we also have periodic data from the 3 wells in the park, dating back to when they were installed in 1996. This is a composite of chloride, salinity, specific conductivity data collected by multiple people from different depths in the wells, and also from water level, or from water pumped from the wells. So that explains some of the variability in these data. So again, we would be very cautious to use it to identify long-term trends. Okay. In 2007, the park began collecting continuous data from the wells. This is depth to water in each of the wells. And this is specific conductivity in the 2 wells closest to Keauhou Fish Pond. Okay. And this is when pumping, irrigation, and injection started at the Shores of Keauhou. So we have a little bit of baseline data. As I said, we're concerned about increasing salinity, and I know David Barnes showed you this morning that salinity started to, well, he showed you in their data. What I looked at, when I saw about 2011, salinity started to decline in the wells in the park. And I wanted to know if we could explain that, and if we could also explain some of the daily fluctuations in water levels and salinity in these wells. Okay. So that's the area where salinity starts to decline. Okay. So in general, all the coastal wells are influenced on a daily basis by changes in the ocean tide and changes in air pressure. So water levels in the park fluctuate about 2 feet due to changes in the tide and air pressure. Okay. And this is barometric pressure. It also varies seasonally. Okay. And there are also longer-term regional stresses on the aquifer system. Pumping has increased about 80% since 1980. And the next chart. This is rainfall data in 2 rainfall gauges in the aquifer system. According to the University of Hawaii, rainfall is declining in the area of the park and in the Keauhou aquifer system. And according to NOAA, sea level is rising. This is data from 2 tide gauges on the Big Island. And NOAA has determined that sea level has risen over a foot in the past century. Okay. And so I wanted to know, what I wanted to do was remove the daily fluctuations and look for these longer-term trends. And so I'm going to show you the results of from 2 wells. I filtered the data, the continuous data, for tides, barometric pressure, and local rainfall. And on this chart, this is water level from the well near the visitor center in the park. And the red dots are measured data, and the green line is what's left over after you remove fluctuations or filter the data for tides and changes in air pressure and local rainfall. Okay? And now, so what we did was reduced the fluctuations from 2 feet to about hundredths of a foot, and now you can see a water level signal from the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan. Okay. This is salinity data from the well that you saw this morning near Keauhou Fish Pond. And filtering these data did not reduce the variability by much, and you still see a decline in salinity in around 2011. Okay. So I wanted to know, are we seeing the same things in the data from the well field? And what you can see, you can go, Jeff, is chloride is declining in one of the wells on the boundary, and that's MW 400. And Steve Bowles presented this information to the roundtable in 2012, and at the time he said, he pointed out these declines in chloride, and he said an irrigation valve had been left open on the golf course. And you could see chlorides continue to decline in that well and in another well. And from what David showed us this morning, I think that it's possible that irrigation water from that nursery that they have near the well. Okay. We also know that, well, in 2009, the USGS, Chip Hunt from the USGS detected elevated nitrates in one of the wells on the boundary. He presented this information to the roundtable, and he said that those nitrates were due to fertilizer from the golf course. So it's possible that irrigation water from the golf course or the nursery is flowing into the park, but we would need more information to confirm that. The point of this example is to show you the monitoring data and to show you that there is a lot of noise in the monitoring data, and that's from environmental fluctuations and potentially from land use, nearby land use. So given all of this noise in the data in the park, from the wells in the park, I don't think you can expect to discern the effects of 1 or 2 pumping wells in the high-level aquifer in this data from the park. Okay. It's also difficult to differentiate climate-related trends from the effects of groundwater withdrawals. The University of Hawaii researchers have found that Hawaii Island has experienced the largest long-term declines in rainfall in the state. Here the Kona area is the most affected area on the island and in the state. And declining rainfall also contributes to saltwater intrusion, so preserving freshwater discharge is a natural defense against these changes. Okay. Climate researchers at the University of Hawaii have encouraged the Commission to identify which areas are most threatened by climate-related trends and to start the process for designating them. So they are asking you to use designation as a forward-looking tool to protect the water supply. And we are also asking you to use designation in a proactive manner as a forward-looking tool to protect the water supply. Okay. We understand that water use is only 37% of the sustainable yield in the Keauhou aquifer system. This chart shows water use as a percentage of sustainable yield in designated areas. And it compares the Keauhou Aquifer with all the other designated areas in the state. So we realize that we are not yet at 90%. We don't think that waiting until water use is 90% of the sustainable yield, like in EAL. We don't think that will allow you the flexibility that you need to maximize beneficial use and at the same time protect non-consumptive uses, public trust uses of groundwater, environmental and cultural uses of groundwater. And so that's why we are asking you to be proactive and to designate at this time to protect resources along the coast. Okay? So to summarize my talk, you have observed impacts from saltwater intrusion at the Keauhou shaft. And the RAM model and the early USGS model, they predict that water levels will decline and discharge will decline in the area of the park due to groundwater withdrawals. We know that water demand is increasing, that rainfall is declining, and that withdrawals in the area of the park are increasing. And this last point is the one that you have the most control over. And that's what we're asking you to consider when you permit new wells in the aquifer system. Where they are located. Are they located near important public trust resources that you want to protect?
First of all, I want to thank everybody for this morning. It was a real pleasure to share the resources under our care with you. It was very hot, so I appreciate your persistence in that as well. I'm going to be talking about the information that we considered in determining whether reduced freshwater inputs would adversely affect the plants and animals and the habitats in the park. Clean fresh water plays an important role in the functioning of the fish ponds, the ancholine pools, and the nearshore coastal marine waters, and therefore affects the plants and animals that live in those resources. And as I mentioned today, a true test of the biological integrity of these systems is the ability of those plants and animals to complete their life cycle. So the adults need to be able to reproduce successfully, those young need to be able to grow up, and they need to be able to reproduce themselves as well. So that's going to be a recurring theme throughout the next couple of slides. And sorry, my clicker is at a distance, and the information in these slides is in it's 11 through 16 of the petition. So ancholine pools in the park provide habitat for rare endemic insects, crustaceans, and mollusks. Many of these are extremely rare, and also includes plants and some species that haven't yet to be described. In fact, we've just been working with a researcher in Japan who's describing a new mollusk. One rare endemic species associated with ancholine pools is the orange-black damselfly. This previously was the most common damselfly in the state, and it is now a candidate for protection under the Endangered Species Act. It's gone. It's no longer on the island of Kauai. It's thought to be gone from Maui, and it's nearly gone from Oahu, and those declines have to do with loss of water. So the USGS and University of Hawaii collaborated on a study to examine the effect of temperature and salinity on the larvae of the damselfly. And the data shown up in the right-hand corner shows that they discovered that the salinity is on the bottom, increasing to the right, and the percent larval or naiad survival is going up, and each line is a different temperature. So these data show that the damselfly cannot reproduce in salt water, and they do better at colder temperatures. I think that's it. Sorry. And so reducing freshwater flow into the park may jeopardize one of the few remaining populations of this species. Amakapa Fish Pond, we didn't get there, So I'm happy to be able to show you this slide. It's a beautiful place, a 30-acre wetland and fish pond. And it's defined by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as core habitat necessary for the recovery of the Hawaiian stilt and the Hawaiian coot. Both are endangered. And Aimakapa'a has no direct connection to the sea, as does Keauhou Fish Pond that we saw earlier today. It's impounded behind this sand berm, and it's fairly fresh. It's about 12 parts per thousand. As with the other habitats that we're talking about, restriction on fresh water is likely to affect the breeding success, fledging success of the Hawaiian stilt and the Hawaiian coot. The chicks need fresher water. The adults are able to move around, but the chicks are fairly restricted. And coots in particular select for lower salinity environments. We don't see coots at Keauhou Fish Pond, for example, at all. And the stilts, in general, as Darcy mentioned, they seem to reproduce better. They select for, where it's available, they select for lower salinity environments. So according to, sorry, clicker, thank you, coot and stilt on the right. And according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, saltwater intrusion and reduced freshwater discharge may adversely affect the long-term recovery of these species. In Keauhou Fish Pond. Keauhou Fish Pond is productive. You saw the fish jumping out there today. Traditional Hawaiian mariculture fish pond, and it's undergoing restoration. Freshwater inputs creates estuarine habitat for the juvenile fish, the ama, the ava, the hole. And studies on the ama larvae and fry show that they have different salinity requirements as they grow up. According to the Hawaii Division of Aquatic Resources, reducing freshwater discharge could result in a loss of nursery habitat for these species, culturally important fish. And Dr. Bob of DAR, Dr. Bob Nishimoto, who's retired now, suggests that Hawaiian fish ponds may need further protection for this reason. And the National Park Service, we're seeking to maintain optimal conditions for cultural production of the fish and provide a healthy fish pond. I think there's another. Thank you. Right. Nearshore tide pools. Freshwater discharge into tide pools provides nursery habitat for juvenile fish and optimal growing conditions for some limu. University of Hawaii researchers studied the effect of salinity on a species of limu found along the Kona coast and concluded that excessive groundwater withdrawals may limit the productivity and distribution of this culturally important native species. And here you see a similar graph to the one I showed before with the naiad damselfly larvae. And again, you see that there is an optimal salinity range in there. I think that's... And coastal waters. We're also concerned about changes to water quality. And groundwater discharges along most of the park's coastline. And let's see, a graph here. The University of Hawaii is just putting out a study that shows that gross primary production is increased in groundwater plumes. And that's the taller bars on the left, and that's Keauhou Fish Pond in the blue and Keauhou Bay in the red. And so gross primary production means more plant phytoplankton growth. When you, a concern is restriction of groundwater flow may tend to concentrate nutrients in the groundwater. And then when you add on top of that land-based inputs, that you'll get an increase in load and the nutrients. And that's certainly a concern for us, particularly Honokaha Bay, which is considered a 303D impaired water body under the Clean Water Act. Thank you. So University of Hawaii studies concludes that at current nutrient reloading rates, Honokaha Bay will exhibit further degradation in future years. And decreases in groundwater discharge may significantly alter chemical properties of coastal waters, endangering unique plants and animal species with ecological, cultural, and economic value. And Paula.
There's just one more slide.
to summarize. Yes. Thank you, Sally. And just to summarize what we talked about, groundwater withdrawals from the higher elevation and basal aquifers will affect water quality and quantity at the coast. We have numerous peer-reviewed studies that warn that reduced freshwater discharge can adversely affect the habitat for rare and culturally important native species. And there is uncertainty regarding the timing and the magnitude of these effects, but that this uncertainty is not a reason for inaction. So thank you very much.